Okay, well, welcome to this webinar this afternoon. Today we are spending time talking about responding to the differences between batterer intervention prevention programs and anger management programs. I'm going to be talking about the characteristics of both services and the reasons why you would be better served to send a domestic violence offender into batterer intervention and not into anger management, and where anger management is quite appropriate for certain people, and what the overlaps might be. And we'll be spending some time talking about working within a community and where that fits into doing both. So what I am going to do is I'm going to start off this webinar by asking you all a bit of a poll question. There are a couple times where I'm going to be posing these polls, and I'm going to mute the lines for now, and I'll unmute them
the conference has been muted
when we get done with this poll. So all of you that are on the webinar, spend a moment clicking off what you think. Domestic violence is caused by an anger problem. Do you strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree? What is your thought? If you have a group of people, of course, you're only going to get to choose one answer, so decide amongst yourselves, go with consensus voting, what have you. I'm going to open it up to the lines after I get a bunch of responses, and we'll talk a bit about what your reasons might be for either agreeing or disagreeing that domestic violence is caused by an anger problem. I think it's good to ask this question starting off because this is kind of the core of what we're going to be talking about. What is domestic violence, and where does it overlap with anger or not? So I'll give you a moment to click off your response, and then we'll open the lines for a bit of discussion on that. People are moving right along on their responses, and then I'll show everybody what the results are and all that fun stuff. We've got 13 responses. So what we're looking at so far is that 43% basically strongly disagree with that statement. 35% disagree, and we have about it looks like about 21% that agree or strongly agree with that statement. So the poll might change a little bit in numbers as not everybody has responded to it yet. But I think this is something that would be interesting to hear from some people about. So I'm going to unmute, and we can talk about it for a moment.
The conference has been unmuted.
So for all of you that responded to the poll, for those of you that said that you strongly agreed or agreed with that statement, what sort of reasons do you have for this?
I don't know. The one thing that I looked at was that something has to start it. I mean, because a lot of times you look at the television ads when they talk about domestic violence and stuff, it always seemed like there was a pattern.
Okay.
And it was like it went from father to son to father to son. I mean, it's something there, and it's something that's not resolved.
Okay.
So I think as far as the anger problem, it's something there. I mean.
So I hear you saying that it's an origin piece, that domestic violence has a starting point maybe with anger. Okay.
And you got to look at too. We're like an old school, and I hate to say like old school generational thing too, because it was like a lot of it. It was like if they seen their fathers or grandfathers or the forefathers do it, they thought it was right.
Okay.
Because you look at even how far that women have come in this day and age too. Suddenly we have a voice where before we didn't.
Okay. Well, thanks, Danette. Anyone else who agreed or strongly agreed? Your thoughts on why you agree with that statement? I just want to put it out there. I think that question is more complex than what it's stated, but it's good to start somewhere with this. So, anyone else who agreed or strongly disagreed? Why you agree or strongly agree with this statement? All right. Well, those of you who strongly disagreed or just disagreed, what were some of the reasons that you had for that?
Well, I'll go. First of all, I don't think anger is a problem, but our response to anger is.
Okay.
And if our response to anger is the problem, then why would we respond by beating our spouse or by abusing our spouse when we're angry at our boss? We don't. So it's not the anger that causes the actions, it's something else.
All right. Well, I must be doing pretty good with my voices so far because I'm pretty sure that's Jeff, right?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Jeff. Anyone else that disagrees or strongly disagrees with that statement want to chime in? All right.
Chris, I'll chime in.
Okay.
Anger's an emotion. We all get angry. It's just what we choose to do after that. You know.
Okay.
The violence is a choice thing.
All right. Well, thank you, John. I am doing good with my voices today. That's excellent. All right. Okay. So I'm going to mute the call again, and we're going to start talking about some of these pieces.
The conference has been muted.
So I think that as we get into talking about the differences, the first thing we have to do is start to separate out what each of these services are. So many of you on the line have experience with batterer intervention prevention programs in West Virginia. There are some of you who have not as much experience with that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what are BIPs in West Virginia as a whole. So some characteristics are that each program is licensed by the Family Protection Services Board in this state. They have license requirements that are set by the legislative rule Title 191 Series 3, which, as I mentioned earlier, will be provided at the end of this webinar. So each program that wants to do BIPs has to apply through FPSB, and they have to meet those requirements. And it's about a year process. Currently, we have 14 licensed programs in the state, and they are broken up by community-based nonprofit programs, community corrections-based programs, and Division of Corrections prison-based programs. So there are profound differences between those three types of BIPs classes. The community-based nonprofit programs, many of them are under an umbrella of a multi-service agency. So they do batterer intervention in addition to doing maybe substance abuse treatment, mental health counseling, homelessness services, a number of different things. And some examples of that are, for instance, Goodwill of Huntington. They have a number of services that they provide. And the two YWCA programs that provide BIPs also do services for victims and survivors of domestic violence, among other things. So there's only one program in the state that's a freestanding community nonprofit that just does BIPs, and that's Community Alternatives to Violence in the Eastern Panhandle. And I know they're represented on the call today. So the community-based nonprofits, they interact with referrals from the community correction sites and from the courts themselves. So it's an interesting sort of linkage, but they do their services without the being in-house at a court system like the community corrections-based programs do. Community corrections have multiple services they provide for offenders, and that can include batterer intervention, but it also can include anger management, substance abuse services, mental health services, parenting services. There are a lot of different products and services that they do for people that are going through the system. And since they're typically directly connected to the courts, they have easy access to a lot of the workers there. And then there are the Division of Correction sites and the prison-based systems, and they have a very different sort of class setting where you have incarcerated offenders, and many of them have been in prison for a number of years, so they're not necessarily in a relationship, and if they are in a relationship, they're not having contact with that person on an ongoing basis. So the discussions are going to be much different than the community-based programs, where you'll have guys who either are in relationships or out of relationships looking for a new one, or have an off and on sort of relationship, which provides a different breadth of discussion in those classes. So understanding the difference in those types of BIPs can be helpful in your community and understanding which BIPs are in your community. And I think that it's also important to consider what are traits of relationship abusive men, that men who are referred to batterer intervention prevention programs, many of them, most of them even, have not committed crimes outside of domestic violence. There are a number of abusers who come into BIPs who have committed a lot of different crimes, whether it be property crimes, crimes against persons that they're not in relationships with, road rage, selling of drugs, using of drugs, any number of different crimes that they may have been convicted of. However, many of the men who come to BIPs are not career criminals, so to speak. They're there for violating restraining orders, for assaulting their partners, and other crimes that are associated with domestic violence. And that's an interesting trait, because often I think there's a perception in the community that that people that go to BIPs are criminals, and many of them are not criminals in the same way that that other criminals are. They've committed a domestic violence offense. And there's also a perception in the community that substance abuse causes domestic violence. And in relationship abusive men, substance abuse escalates abusive behavior. It doesn't directly cause it. And there's some interesting history behind that belief, that in the 1870s there was a group that was formed, the Christian Temperance Union, that was made up of a lot of women who had this belief that alcohol brought out the devil in men. And so what these women saw was that their male partners were becoming violent under the influence of alcohol. So they believed that once men drank alcohol, the devil came in and started to alter their personality and their actions. And so that belief was very strong, and you had, at that time, women that would go to bars and with axes, 40, 50 women, and destroy kegs, destroy alcohol bottles, and they were very involved in creating prohibition. And that belief still is out there in our communities, that alcohol brings out the devil in men. The challenge with that is that 80% of the adult population drinks on some level, and you don't see 80% of people being domestically violent. So there's a disconnect in that level alone. However, something that ends up being a common sort of discussion within a BIPS class has to do with using alcohol and other drugs as excuses for behavior. That it wasn't me, it was the alcohol. I'm never like this when I'm drunk. You know, I had a little too much tequila, I mixed it with wine and beer, and I shouldn't mix all those, it causes me to go crazy. There's a lot of those sort of excuses that guys use. And a response that I've used over time when I've done BIPs, and I've mentioned this in BIPs trainings before, that I ask men, how many drinks does it take you to sexually molest a child? And the men in the groups often will be angry by that question. And they'll say, that's ridiculous. There's no number of drinks that would cause me to do that. That's disgusting. That's wrong. That's sick. And the thing is that if you have a belief system when you're sober that there is no way that you would ever commit a certain action, then it doesn't matter how many drinks you have, you're not going to do it. Relationship abusive men have beliefs when they are sober, thoughts when they are sober, that it's okay for them to control their partners, to make them do something, to keep them from doing something, to cause fear, to cause pain, that all of that is okay. And what alcohol does is it releases those inhibitions. They may think about things like, they may think to themselves, oh, I should just hit her. I should just slap her in the face. This is ridiculous. But they may not act on it when they're sober. When they drink, that inhibition is lost, and they will choose to do things that are more abusive, more violent. So it's not that it causes it, it just escalates those beliefs that are already there. And so that's a very big trait for relationship abusive men. Relationship abusive men tend to be self-oriented versus others-oriented. And the sort of story that I once heard that I always makes me, I always think of it when this point comes up, is an example of someone who has a healthy sort of orientation to life and relationships. they may be sitting there with a canvas, and they may be painting the world around them, and they may be starting to paint this landscape and these people, and then as the landscape changes, maybe a barn gets destroyed, they change the landscape of their portrait to make sure that the barn isn't there. They'll add a person if a person is there. Whatever the case might be, they alter their canvas as the world around them changes and as their perception changes. Relationship abusive men have the same canvas, but what they do is they'll paint their landscape, and then if the barn falls down, they'll start throwing paint to where the barn was, hoping that that barn will suddenly appear again from the paint being thrown at it. That relationship abusive men tend to want to take their perceptions and make their perceptions everyone's perceptions, make their perceptions their partner's perceptions, their children's perceptions. And they want life to flow easily by making people be on the same place that they are. So they're very focused on their own perceptions, their own motivations, their own lives, and they're not very focused on how they're impacting others. Another way of thinking about it is that what is true for someone who is respectful and healthy in their relationship, they tend to notice their own behavior and how it is that it impacts those around them. So in my relationship, I might be doing something like not cleaning the dishes. And so I notice that my partner gets upset when I don't do the dishes. So I start doing the dishes more regularly and cleaning up after myself in that way because I don't want to impact her in that way. Relationship abusive men will tend to focus on how it is she is behaving and how it is that makes him feel. So if I didn't do the dishes because I didn't feel like it, I had other things to do, and she is upset about me not doing the dishes, and so she starts to complain to me, then I'm focused on, she's complaining to me, it's making me irritated, I just want to watch this show, and so what can I do to shut her up? That the focus is on she is making me feel a certain way, and so it's a different orientation to life, and abusers very much have that sort of standpoint. Abusers are also excellent radars of others, and this, I think, is the biggest and most challenging point in working in domestic violence and working in batterer intervention, is that abusers are really good at determining what they can and cannot get away with. And that serves them very well in their relationships, is that they know just when to turn on the charm, when to do these quick fixes, when to take things that they're normally abusive over and just be smooth and to convince her that they're going to change. And they're really good at that, but they're also really good at it within their community of friends and family, and within the greater community with the court systems, with therapists, counselors, etc., that they are very good at testing the waters. This happens in BIPS groups all the time when you have guys that enter into a group and they test the waters by resisting in different ways, where they might complain about their fee and they see if a facilitator will be maybe a little more listening to that and will give in to that request. Or they might start to make excuses for their behavior, and they kind of detect how the facilitator responds, and if they let them get away with that, then maybe they'll try something a little bit more. So that creates a real problem because they are so good at knowing when to move forward in their control and when to turn it around and not be controlling. And that becomes a great challenge with no matter what service is being offered to them. And unless sociopathic, and there are sociopathic abusers, the estimated number is that 8 to 10% of domestic violence offenders are sociopaths. I don't know. I think in some ways it's even lower than that. In all my years of doing batterer intervention, I've had about 4 or 5 guys that I would say were definitely sociopaths. There weren't a lot, but they are out there. And so most abusers tend to feel shame for their behavior. They don't want to talk about it because they feel that guilt, they feel that shame. And the guilt and shame isn't enough for them to change. It is enough to lead them to be motivated to learn how not to get arrested again. And often that's what ends up happening, is that you have guys who they get their first time offense for domestic violence, and so their whole focus is, how can I not get arrested again? How can I not get in trouble with the system again? And they might be controlling of their partner to do that. They might be spending time telling her, you know, you better not call the police again. Look at how much money this is costing us. They may say things like that. They may do things to try and keep that from happening again. But they feel shame for their behavior. They don't want to come to BIPs and talk about how they were abusive. They don't want to own up and be responsible for ways that they hurt their partner and their children. That's uncomfortable. That's really difficult to do, and they prefer not to do it. So if they don't have to talk about it, if they can talk about how other people's behavior fits, then that's what they're going to talk about. And it creates real problems within the system when they do that. So one of the challenges is that with doing this work, the name of the service, Batterer Intervention Prevention Program, the word batterer is a real challenge. Mainly because batterer is an identifier for the more sociopathic abusers, the guys who are constantly physically assaultive, constantly threatening, and very dangerous and lethal. And the truth is that most abusers that come to BIPs are not batterers in that way. They may have been physically assaultive on a couple occasions, but it's not a consistent pattern of coercive control in their relationships. They may be more verbally and emotionally controlling, and that's much more common than the sociopathic sorts. But the term batterer fits in with that shame because a lot of abusers will not want to identify that they are even in a batterer intervention program, or they won't want to say that they're a batterer because often they're not. And so what ends up happening is even guys who are in BIPS classes, they'll tell their friends, family, and community they're in anger management because it sounds better. It sounds tough that I have an anger problem. In the state, there are some programs that have looked at ways to make their services more talk about what it is they're trying to do. The most recent is the YWCA in Charleston, the Resolve program. They've shifted their name to the Men's Respect Group. So there are places that are trying to address that, and hopefully we will continue to address that at the state. Okay, so I'm going to unmute the lines and take any questions, comments, thoughts on what are the makeup of BIPs and what are some of the traits of relationship abusive men.
The conference has been unmuted.
All right, so any thoughts, questions, comments on any of those pieces?
I know that, like I say, so far since I've been doing BIPs here at Charleston Work Release, that a lot of the guys that I have in my classes, they don't consider themselves needing BIPs because they don't look at themselves as being batterers.
Right.
But we tend to look at any type of physical abuse if they've had in past relationships, whether if it's, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, even we look at family.
Uh-huh.
But a lot of them, like I say, they don't, it's like they come in kind of spaced out like they don't have a clue and saying, well, I didn't consider myself being a batterer, that type of thing.
And I think that BIPS programs respond differently to this question. I mean, my response would tend to be, well, based on the situation, of course, and whether this guy's a sociopath or not, I would tend to say, well, I agree. You may not be a batterer, but you've definitely done things that have been hurtful to your partner and to your children and to your family. You've done something that was abusive, and that needs to be looked at. That I'll agree that you're not a batterer, but you definitely have things that you need to work on in your relationship and in your life, and this is the place to do it.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, it's a huge challenge, and the term does end up being a demotivator, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks, Danette.
You're welcome.
All right. Any other thoughts, questions, comments on any of the traits of relationship abusive men or makeup of BIPs? We'll be referring back to some of those as we move forward, especially the one about the radar piece, because that's a critical reason why anger management and BIPs differ. All right. Well, moving on then.
The conference has been muted.
Okay, So we'll talk a little bit about the requirements for BIPs through the Title 191 Series 3. So BIPs in the state of West Virginia, they have to have a statement of purpose for what it is that they're doing. They have to have clear guidelines and contracts. They have to be very transparent in how it is that they're doing their work and communicate that to guys when they first enter into the program. There's a 32-session minimum, which is just a minimum. There are some programs that do more than 32 sessions, and I know the prison-based systems do a minimum of 36. They have more time, which is helpful. I know across the nation, the average length for BIPs is 29 sessions. There are some states that have 52-session requirements, some that have, I think Mississippi has an 18-session requirement, which is really low. But the average is 29 sessions. So we're not that far from that. So when you're working on dealing with someone's patterns of behavior over time, really 32 sessions is just a start as well. So doing less than that is really going to impact the ability of someone to change their thoughts and beliefs. Each Batterer Intervention Prevention Program is required to have a curriculum that depicts domestic violence as a system of abuse and methods of power and control. In West Virginia, we have, over the past 2 years, created a West Virginia curriculum for Batterer Intervention Prevention, and it's pretty extensive. There are 32 sessions with multiple activities. I would guess there are at least 50 activities in the manual, and it has a lot of different ways of talking about hurtful behaviors in relationships, creating clarity for terms and thoughts and beliefs and ideas, and how to make shifts on those. So the programs tend to use the curriculum in different ways. There are some that use the Duluth model, some that use the Emerge model. The West Virginia curriculum is a blend of both of those and some additional pieces from other national models, and some homebrew stuff. So all programs have to follow a curriculum that does that. They have to work to teach non-abusive, non-violent interactions in a relationship. That's pretty key. That I think, and you'll probably hear me repeat this again, that we need to be looking at the change we want to see in abusers. We need to be thinking about not just having them admit for admission's sake. We want to be able to look at how can you respond differently? How can you have a respectful response to a challenging situation? It's those types of things that really, I think, are important in doing this work, and that is a requirement. That part of BIPs, there's a discussion of legal and social consequences. I think that there's a constant work to talk about social consequences for abusive behavior. There is a need to understand and discuss dynamics of domestic violence in the context of power and control. I'm going to show you a couple models, a couple systems of addressing power and control in a minute. But all programs have to have that same sort of look at understanding the dynamics of domestic violence within a context of power and control. Each program has to have the ability to teach about the effects of domestic violence on children and the effects on victims, partners, survivors. And I would expand that. I think that most of the BIPs also spend time talking about the effects on community, the effects on extended family, and the effects on abuser himself. Each program needs to have personal understanding of the historical context of violence against women. That's a huge piece. History is long. There's a lot of examples of places where violence against women has gone on and been curbed in different ways. So understanding that we work within a context of history is pretty important. And we talk about that during BIPS trainings here at the Coalition quite a lot. Each program has to conduct lethality assessment on an ongoing basis with abusers. So as abusers are in the classes, facilitators are constantly looking for signs of lethality and being aware of that when going forward. So that's a requirement for all the programs. They have to have a knowledge of state and federal laws and policies pertaining to domestic violence. They have to have an ability to discuss and educate on interpersonal relationships, human behavior, and development. And a lot of the activities in the West Virginia curriculum spend time talking about those pieces. and they need to work as a part of community coordinated response. That is huge. The two major national models, the Emerge program out of Boston, which is the oldest program in the world, and the Duluth model out of Duluth, Minnesota, which is the most commonly used program in the world. Duluth's strongest trait is their community coordinated response, that they believe that in order to address domestic violence, in order to end domestic violence, you have to have a whole community on board with the same values, the same ideas, the same responses. And so Batterer intervention in the Duluth model is a very small part of a greater community response. And some of the difficulties with groups that use the Duluth model is if they're using the Duluth model and their community is not coordinated, their Batterer intervention program is going to suffer. And also domestic violence perpetrators are going to suffer, and their victims and children are going to suffer because they're not able to look at an entire community responding and making changes. So it is a requirement in the state standards that each program has to work as a community coordinated response. And that happens in different ways, whether it be actions within a STOP team, whether it be creating cross-training and MOUs within other agencies and domestic violence programs. And we'll talk a little bit more about community coordinated response in a bit. So before moving on, I'm going to unmute and see if there are any questions about Title 191 and all of the requirements that BIPs have to follow.
The conference has been unmuted.
So any questions, thoughts, comments on Title 191? And
just stick it in your purse or something and I can pick it up later.
You can stick the
I
191
really don't know
in your
what the
purse.
figures are, if it was my bank statement or what it was.
Just a reminder, I'm going to randomly be opening the call, so that kind of creates confusion. Or 6 if you need
Yeah,
to.
I probably would need it because I don't
Someone
know
had
what.
a
I haven't
question?
in my purse. I was going to clean it out, and I haven't cleaned it out yet.
Hello?
Hey, Chris.
Yes.
Okay.
Hey, Chris.
Carolyn, yes.
Yeah, hi.
Probably was. And he
Maybe I missed this.
he wrote down with his dad. Remember when his dad
maybe I
called and told
should
him?
be quiet. So whoever was
Yeah.
Let's see here. Carolyn, you still there?
Yeah, but somebody keeps talking. Anyway, so I just dropped out of the thing for a minute. Is Title 191, is that being rewritten? Maybe I missed that part, but I apologize if I did. Is that being rewritten?
I'm listening to a
It's not that it's being rewritten.
conference call listening about the difference between
The Title 191 is being revised. It hasn't been revised since 2003, and there was a bit of a delay in being able to change it because of some legal issues within the state. But that's been addressed, and we're hoping that there will be updates to that within the next 2 years. And as it comes forward, the Title 191 is going to be worked on by the Family Protection Services Board, and there will be a chance for programs to provide feedback on things that they think works or don't work within those. So yeah, I've done some review of guidelines and protocols throughout the nation. West Virginia's are okay. There are some places where we could learn a lot from other states, but it's served us well since 2003. It's time for an update. But basically, the Title 191 provides unity for all of the BIPs within our state. Every batterer intervention prevention program has to abide by these standards. So it creates this baseline for what it is that we do. So any other questions, comments before we move on? All right.
The conference has been muted.
So I'm going to talk about some of the specific differences that when it comes to batterer intervention, batterer intervention has those licensing agreements like I just went over, and that creates a base level of response. Anger management, there is no licensing requirement for anger management. In West Virginia, I don't know of any licensing requirement for anger management anywhere in the United States. Anger management is a wild card of a service. I used to do anger management at Emerge up in Boston. We created anger management program to filter out guys who would call us all the time and say, I need to get into anger management. Since we didn't have anger management, we would say, well, we don't have anger management, we have this batterer intervention program, and of course guys would hang up right after that. So we created anger management as a way to screen, but then we started seeing people that were obviously there for things like road rage, barroom brawls, fight with police. But we learned quite a lot by doing that. But one of the common things is that since they are not licensed, there's no base for response. So you have any number of things that anger management programs do, and the quality is so incredibly varied. It's really difficult to trust that someone being sent to anger management is actually going to be doing something that's going to be beneficial for him, for his family, for the community. Batterer intervention has a formalized review of the program, staff, and classes. FPSB does yearly site visits, and those programs that have tight relationships through their community coordinated response with domestic violence programs in their area occasionally get an advocate who sits in on one of the BIP's classes and gives feedback about creating a batterer intervention class that's victim-focused, victim-centered. Which is really important in doing this work. So there is that ongoing formalized review of the quality and what it is that happens within those classes. And again, with anger management, there's no formalized review. So counselors, facilitators, therapists that do anger management, they can do whatever they want in those classes, and unless there's a complaint toward an agency that does it, there's no sort of checks and balances on it. Batterer intervention has methods statewide, and they have consistent themes and approaches. We have the West Virginia curriculum, so everybody has that. That's a licensed program, and they can choose to use it in any number of ways, but they have the same resources, the same base of what it is that they're doing. Anger management, the methods vary widely. Sometimes there are anger management programs that use systems that were in place in the 80s that are sorely outdated, that there's been research proving that such tactics are dangerous. An example of that is in the 80s there was this anger management technique where therapists would use bataki bats, which are these bats, they're like foam bats that have a handle, and they would put on armor, like headgear and stuff, and they would hand one to partners, a man and a woman, and they would go out and just wail on each other with these bats. And then after they were done, they would say, oh, I feel better for having had this sort of striking out piece. And a similar technique that was used is that they would have a man and a woman that were in a relationship stand like 10 yards apart and then just say, yell at each other, get it all out. So they would yell and scream and say any number of things. They couldn't leave their 10 yards, and then when they were done, they would come back together and talk it out. Problem is that they discovered that doing those things actually rehearsed those responses, and people that did them were more likely to be physically assaultive with the bataki bats or verbally assaultive with the yelling back and forth on the 10-yard lines. So those are really old methodologies that are out of favor and have evidence that states that they're dangerous, but yet those still are used by some anger management therapists, groups, counselors, and that can be really dangerous. And so since there's no sort of checks and balances on the system, you don't know what you're getting. There are some that are really good, but it's really impossible to know without knowing the therapist, without sitting in on a class, without doing that sort of work. So batterer intervention, the focus is on coercive control in relationships. In BIPs, there is a real work on figuring out what are the patterns of behavior. How has abusive, controlling, violent behavior built over time, and what are the places where it started to really get controlling? And so there's a lot of talk in the classes and having guys describe how it is that their relationship has developed. In anger management, the focus is based on the instructor-counselor prerogative. So the facilitator, counselor, therapist, whoever is running the anger management class can make a decision that, well, we're going to just focus on this road rage incident, and we're just going to talk about that. And often that's what happens in anger management, is there's not a look at an entire history of behavior. There's just a specific incident. And, in a way that makes sense, because we have someone who had a fight with police or a barroom brawl or road rage incident, you want to look at that incident. You want to figure out, why'd you do that, and how can you not do it anymore? And so there's more of a more prerogative for instructors and counselors to not look at history and not to look at some of the underlying causes, just to look at how do you stop this from this point forward. BIP's activities include uncovering attitudes and beliefs behind behavior, raising awareness of harms caused, and work toward making repairs and amends. The BIP's curriculum has, all of the lessons have a combination of these sort of ideas. There's a really important piece to becoming aware of behavior. Admission, as I said earlier, admission for admission's sake is kind of pointless, is that anybody could say, yeah, I did it, but it's really being able to understand why you did it and how you can choose something different that really makes a difference. So uncovering attitudes, understanding why did you do it, what were you thinking before you made that decision, what were you thinking after you made that decision, and how can you be aware of the impact of your choices on others. So there are all these activities that are structured that are used statewide. Anger management spends a lot of time in many of the programs focusing on how to manage emotions. And I'll talk a bit later about why that's in quotes, managing emotions. They focus on skills training and stress management. So in anger management, there's often a focus on looking at how it is that you can reduce your anger, how it is you can reduce your stress, how you can have better time management, how you can relax, how you can take time out. Those things can be really helpful, but when it comes to domestic violence, often what happens is you have a more calm abuser. You have someone who's very relaxed and very willing to control and hurt his loved ones. So it's timeouts are a great example of that, because in a healthy, respectful relationship, if there's a timeout that's taken and there's no element of fear, no element of pain involved, and it's a respectful and negotiated timeout, a couple can say, can we take a break, not talk about this right now, we'll come back in a few minutes and have a conversation. Well, they'll follow through, come back, and continue the conversation where it ended. When it comes to abusers, they will often use timeouts as another control and abuse tactic, is they get to decide when to have an argument, how it goes, whether to come back to it or not, and they can always use threats if they have to get away with that timeout. You know what happens if I don't take a timeout right now, or, oh, I need to take a timeout right now, things are getting really heated, you know what happened last time. Those sort of things are very common for abusers. So teaching tactics of reducing anger, of teaching skills, isn't necessarily going to work with someone who has an underlying pattern that goes back for a long period of time within a relationship with an individual. Anger management that's done for people who have stranger violence, they don't have a relationship with that person. They're probably meeting them for the first time, and so they're going to be responding to an overall sort of approach to life, which is much different than a built-up relationship with someone that's gone on over time. So BIPS also is exclusive to licensed programs. It's in a group format, and it's personalized to individual abusers. So all of the BIPs that are operating are licensed, and there are pending programs. There are about 9 pending programs, all of which are community corrections programs applying for BIP status. But pending programs, during the course of application, they start to do classes and receive feedback and get more monitoring on that note as they move forward. But they have a process. Since there isn't any licensing requirement, anger management are not given a sort of feedback loop. Anger management has a short length of stay, since by and large they don't spend time looking at an extensive history of a relationship. They don't spend time looking at patterns that have built up over a long period. And since they teach skills, they don't have to necessarily spend a lot of time discussing them. They just need to learn them. So there's no need for a longer length of stay. And anger management, there are 3 different kinds of anger management that I've been able to figure out in my experience with anger management. That there is a therapeutic counseling focus for anger management, and often that's done in individual sessions with the therapist or a counselor. And that therapist or counselor will probably use a diagnosis and bill insurance for an anger management problem. And so they'll be dealing with a mental health disorder, and they'll be applying techniques to deal with that disorder. So BIPs don't give diagnoses because it's not a mental health issue. It's not a diagnosable illness when someone is physically assaultive, emotionally assaultive, verbally assaultive to someone. It's not to say that abusers don't have mental illnesses. Some of them do, but then they need to deal with two problems. They need to deal with their choices to be abusive, and they need to deal with their mental health issues. And I know that in my time of doing BIPs, I've had guys who have been bipolar. But I've had friends who have been bipolar, and they've never been abusive in their relationships. That being bipolar in and of itself does not cause domestic violence or cause someone to be violent. I've known people with bipolar who, when they go on their manic highs or on their depressive lows, they tend to do a lot of self-destructive behavior, but they would never want to hurt those that they love. And so it's not the mental health issue that's going on for abusers. But anger management, they spend more time in a therapeutic counseling environment doing that sort of work. Also, anger management is conducted sometimes as a component of substance abuse treatment. Those sort of anger management programs look at anger and how it overlaps with a specific substance. And there are some extensive looks at different types of drugs that may cause rage. In fact, a big one is the use of steroids, which is interesting to me. I had a guy in BIPS once that we ended up closing his case. He was dying from colon cancer, and he was taking a steroid, and he literally started to yell, scream, and explode at his partner. And when we got information on his history, he had none of that in his history. He did not have a coercive, controlling pattern in his relationship. And we were able to find that out through contacts with the domestic violence program in the area, as well as direct partner contacts with her. And so there are drugs that do cause changes in personality and behavior, but they're limited. And they're not, and often drugs will have a variety of effects, and for a lot of people, as we were talking about earlier with alcohol, drugs will bring out things that are already there rather than causing them. Also, anger management can be done in an educational setting, which is the way that we did anger management at Emerge. We would spend more time giving education on how to be more aware of your thoughts, more aware of your choices, more aware of how you can make different decisions in life, more aware of your impact on others. So we would do a very similar thing to Batterer intervention, but it would be in an anger management setting with people who had road rage or barroom brawls and those sort of things. So you can have really good anger management programs that have a similar focus, but without any sort of guidelines on how that service is conducted, and without a lot of organization and networking among those programs, it's not possible to really know what you're getting. And teaching techniques to someone who has a coercive history is going to end up with someone with a more gentle coercive pattern, which is not helpful when you're talking about domestic violence and harms in relationships. So I'm going to unmute the lines and give people a chance to ask any questions or comments on those specific differences that we're talking about.
The conference has been unmuted.
So thoughts, questions, comments?
I don't know. The one thing that I was thinking about too, and this was the last time that that I had a chance to sit in on the hate crimes meeting, is that by talking to some of the local police officers that are working in the schools, is that the anger management, which we call managing my anger now, and even some of the BIPs should be, you could be looking at it even within the school system too, especially in the high school. Because you look at a lot of the dating, like the dating problems and different situations that are starting in the high schools. And that, like, and another thing, because we were talking about, too, that when I was telling them about, how we do our programs here, is that they could even do thinking for a change, too.
Whatsoever. I'm muted. Yeah.
So, like I say, that's something that, if nothing else, should be tapped on the horizon for, as far as for the high schools.
Yeah, I think that you're speaking to a really important piece, Danette, which is the reason for community coordinated response is to be able to link up systems that have barriers in the community. And certainly the high school systems are a barrier because high schools don't spend enough time talking about healthy relationships, if at all. No. And often I heard from abusers in my classes, I wish I would have learned this in high school. It would have made all the difference in my life. And it's very common for guys to get behind that. The thing is as a community, we need to make that a priority, and we need to think about how it can be done well. And different organizations are working on doing that. The challenge is always funding, but that's something that is required for batterer intervention programs, is that they are supposed to be a part of community coordinated response. So I know that some programs really link those two together. And for instance, RDVIC, I know that Troy Ball, who is the one of the BIPS facilitators there, he's also a PRO, and so he brings all of the knowledge and skills that he has from doing batterer intervention into the school that he works at, and talks about those things with the teachers, with the students, and those sort of things are really important, and one of the reasons why batterer intervention prevention can be much more effective on that level is because it's not just a group where you do it and you go home. It's really a sort of community-wide work. So, you make an excellent point, and I think that would be great if we had more involvement in schools.
Because, like I say, you got to look at, too, some of the homes where some of the students are. And like I say, that's one of the things that kind of shot out at me because, like I say, a lot of times kids go home, granted they might be latchkey kids. And a lot of the time, the only help that they get is in the schools.
Yeah. Excellent point. All right. Any other thoughts, questions, concerns?
It's Carolyn.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I had one, I guess they're both comments, or maybe one is a question. In this area, anyway, anger management is very popular, and it's very popular because it's a Band-Aid, because it's easily identifiable, at least people think it's easily identifiable. It's confined to a short period of time, and it supposedly, addresses what a lot of people, including the judiciary, think is the issue, and DHHR. So it's very popular. You'll get your information back, you'll get your feedback back at maybe 6 to 12 weeks, and then, they're done. And so it sort of like wraps things up real nice and neat for a lot of the agencies.
Yes,
and the other thing I wanted to mention is that if we could talk about, because I think it's really important in this discussion, the use of the LCMSI to recommend a client to batterers intervention and anger management simultaneously.
Yeah, that's another huge gap in communities, is that since people don't understand the difference between the two, sometimes systems will refer people to anger management and BIP, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I think that I've had experience with many abusers who could use services from anger management, but it's all about the timing. Is that if guys do anger management before going into BIPs, again, since you can't trust the quality of an anger management program, you're going to have guys that maybe are learning skills and are learning ways to blame their abuse on the fact that they have a stress management problem, and that's going to be really hard to work against when the guy comes into BIPs. If, on the other hand, someone has gone through BIPs and learned that they have choices, that they can decide how to live their lives, how to respond to their partners, how to have a respectful relationship, then when they go into anger management, they might be able to spend some time working on some of those skills that might be taught in a way that would be respectful and helpful in a relationship. So it's all about timing. And there are any number of reasons that systems refer to anger management. Certainly because it's neat and tidy might be one of them. But another one is that we'll be talking about here in a few minutes. So thank you, Carolyn. Jeff is bringing up just a comment on what you were stating. The LSCMI is a general criminal recidivism risk assessment. Does not correlate to risk of interpersonal violence or sexual offending. So it's used a little bit differently than I think I heard you saying. So thank you, Jeff, for that clarification. So next up, Kim, are you on the line? You had a question?
Actually, it was me.
Oh, it's Mr. Moles. Go ahead.
I was disguised as Kim.
Ah. Good disguise.
All right. So good job, Mr. Hall. My question is, could you or would you please sum that up into a small statement? If you were to communicate this idea to a magistrate or judge, how would you sum it up quickly when you're sentencing someone to determine whether they belong in BIPs or anger management?
Well, I think it's hard to say quickly. I mean, if I were to
take your time.
If I were to try to respond to the difference in a way that might be compelling, what I would say is that if you have someone who is coming to you because they've been involved in a relationship violence episode, whether it be verbal, emotional, psychological, physical, then they're most appropriate to go to batterer intervention because the history of the relationship is extensive. Even if it's just a couple months, someone has been interacting with that person on an ongoing basis, and there are a lot of nuances to that interaction. Anger management is not going to get into those nuances. It's going to get onto the tip of the iceberg. So what you're going to end up having if they go to anger management is you're going to have people who are dealing with the surface issues and not dealing with the patterns of behavior that need to be addressed in order for someone to end their abusive patterns. So that would be my sort of quick sum up. Because even in the best anger management programs, you're not going to have enough time to deal with coercive control. All right, so I'm going to move on to some more slides, and we'll open up it again.
The conference has been muted.
So just to get into some of the pieces about batterer intervention. Batterer intervention is it's an interesting sort of debate that I can see both sides of, really, although I lean toward one side, of course. Batterer intervention is of course, intervention. However, on many levels, it's not. It's more of an educational awareness raising. Intervention is something that happens within the law enforcement community, that there's a call for domestic violence, the law enforcement officer arrives and makes an arrest and has an action. That's an intervention. CPS gets called. CPS goes and they take the children away, or they require a mother and father to do something in order to keep from getting their children taken away. That's an intervention. Batterer intervention is a place where there is an opportunity to change. There's an opportunity for guys that come into the program to make different choices and to learn different ways of responding. So it's really about bringing awareness that behaviors are hurtful, being aware that perceptions are different between people, that your perceptions are not the perceptions of your partner, and looking at how can you educate people to make different decisions, and how can you start to educate them on being critical in their thinking of how it is that they live their lives. I think one of the biggest things for abusers is they haven't had that introspection. They haven't spent enough time thinking about how it is that their lives are different from their partners, and they aren't necessarily entitled to make their partner do something or keep their partner from doing something, and to be critical in thinking about how their behavior impacts their relationship. A lot of those things are really important for batterer intervention to spend time on, and they do. Batterer intervention is a group discussion. There are cases where individual BIPs is appropriate, although it's very rare. One time I did it, I had a guy who was deaf, and he could only read lips. He couldn't even sign language. And if any of you have experience with sign language in doing any sort of work, it's really difficult to do even sign language in a group process because the sign language people have to keep up with the talking, and it takes a little bit longer. So even if he would have been able to use sign language, I still probably would have seen him individually. And we would talk, and he would read my lips, and it was still difficult. But there are times where that happens. But by and large, BIPs is a group discussion format. And that relates back to abusers being really good radars, is that when you have guys who are really good at detecting what they can and can't get away with, that is really difficult for them to do within a group setting, because you have a lot of different people that are really spending time thinking about what it is you're saying, and so they might be able to pick up on that. And it's also a reason why BIPs groups tend to be co-facilitated, is that if you only have one facilitator, it's easier for a guy to manipulate one person. If you have two people that are on the same team that are working as partners in holding this group accountable and providing opportunities for change, you have more of a place where if an abuser were to try and manipulate me in some way, found my weak spot in responding to topics, then maybe my co-facilitator would see that and give me feedback, or step in and give feedback to this guy, and we would work together to make sure that we are on top of that and are able to have that discussion in a way that's most appropriate and is victim-focused. Also, BIPs are feedback intensive. The whole purpose of BIPs is for guys to have discussions and for facilitators and other class participants to give them feedback on what they see as being something that's helpful, something that they can change, something that isn't helpful, something that they really need to take a better look at. There are any number of things that come out, but the goal is really to give that feedback to make someone think further and hopefully shift their behavior and their thoughts. So it's very much feedback intensive. In West Virginia, primarily batterer intervention is a judicial sanction. There are some voluntary clients around the state at different programs, but it's really small. There are some Child Protective Service referrals, and those vary by region. Some regions have more troubles than others with coordinating that service. But by and large, batterer intervention is a judicial sanction. So you have people who are being sent because they violated a crime, and they're sent to batterer intervention. So that alone is something that is pretty helpful to keep in mind. People volunteer for anger management all the time, partially because it's what people categorize as what they need. It's why the court systems do it a lot of times. They think that anger, they see a guy, they think that he's angry, and so they think he needs to manage his anger, so they put him in that. But batterer intervention is rarely something that is voluntary, which is something that I think we need to work on in the future, is thinking about how can we motivate change, how can we motivate people to notice that they're being hurtful and to start a batterer intervention program sooner than later. But currently that's where we stand. Batterer intervention works on developing respect, empathy, and amends. That the West Virginia curriculum has a lot of activities that really are completely focused on that. Defining and clarifying what is respect, defining and clarifying how to have empathy and how to make amends and repairs to a relationship that you've damaged in some way. And of course, batterer intervention is a component of a community-coordinated response to domestic violence. It's a small component, but it's an important one. That if batterer intervention is not there, then often abusers are sent off to programs where they might learn how to be better abusive. If they go to a counselor who is unaware or untrained in domestic violence, and abusers are really good radars, they might spend a lot of time talking about how they're being hurt by their female partner, and you might have a therapist who backs them up on that and ends up talking to the community, and the community maybe lets him off the hook, and she ends up getting in trouble with the court systems because of that. And that creates major problems. That BIPs, as a component of community coordinated response, if a batterer intervention prevention program is really working on strengthening and making their relationships with others realistic and concrete and authentic, they're going to have cross trainings. They're going to be more apt to talk to therapists and counselors. And even with people that we don't necessarily 100% come from the same way of thinking about things, going to defense attorneys, talking to defense attorneys, they can be great allies in responding to domestic violence. Spending time going to anger management counselors and programs and talking about what it is that they do, learning more about each other, inviting someone to sit in on a class, working with domestic violence programs and having them having some cross-training where batterer intervention program facilitators get more information on working with victims and what that means and what a victim survivor's experience is like. And domestic violence programs learning from a batterer intervention program traits of abusers and how it is that BIPs work with an abuser in a class and how to coordinate partner contacts. There are any number of things, but batterer intervention is part of that process, and it's critically anchored to the community sort of work. But also, it's important to talk about what batterer intervention is not. I've talked a little bit about this already, but batterer intervention is not mental health treatment. You're not going to spend a lot of time talking about someone's emotions and feelings and how it is that they feel about things. You're going to be spending more time talking about how it is they think about things, how it is they believe about things. And no diagnosis is going to be assigned. And you're not going to be working on one guy every single time. You're going to be mixing up the group and working with different people at different times on their issues and having everybody get involved in discussion. And while mental health treatment sometimes has some of those components, batterer intervention does not do mental health treatment in the same way mental health treatment takes components of batterer intervention and does it. So I think that it's important that if an abuser has mental health issues, that they do both services at the same time. I think that that's really important to be able to recognize that the two are completely separate issues. Batterer intervention is not skills training. Anger management focuses a lot on skills training. Batterer intervention spends more time looking at beliefs training and thoughts training, trying to work on attitude and behavior and how it is that those two work together, and how it is that you can look at the roots of your issues rather than just picking the fruits off the tree. So I talked about timeouts earlier as being a good example of how batterer intervention is not a good place to talk about timeouts, and anger management often uses that, and that can create more abusive situations within a relationship if a guy is controlling and manipulative. This is a really challenging one. BIPs is not torture and punishment. I think that court systems and systems in community often get into this mindset that they don't want to send people to batterer intervention because it's so long and costs so much money. And why would they want to put someone through that? That it's torture, having them go there and have to do this the whole time. And it's really an opportunity, and it's a discipline, it's a guidance. That batterer intervention is an opportunity to learn different ways of responding in relationships. It's a chance to have some health in a relationship. It's a chance to do appropriate self-care and for abusers to recognize that taking care of themselves does not mean that it has to be at the expense of their partner. So that's a challenging thing to coordinate within community, is to learn where it is that the court systems believe that batterer intervention is a punishment, and instead talk about where it is that it's an opportunity for change. Batterer intervention is not couples counseling or couples counseling by proxy. It's a real challenge when dealing with domestic violence. When abusers are sent to BIPs, victims and survivors of domestic violence don't always want to identify themselves as a victim. They don't want to identify themselves as a battered woman. They want to look at the fact that, he's a great guy that I love, and he happens to hurt me, and I don't want him to hurt me anymore, but I don't want to end the relationship either. So I don't want to call a domestic violence program because I haven't been domestically violenced, So some partners will spend time calling BIPs in a hope that they can give information on how to best work with their abusive partner. And that's a danger for batterer intervention, and also an opportunity for batterer intervention to support the work that domestic violence programs are doing and send partners to those services for support groups, for individual counseling, for all the services that they can provide. Batterer intervention is an opportunity to give abusers an opportunity to change. Domestic violence programs are an opportunity for victims of domestic violence to start to become empowered and to start to increase their safety. So batterer intervention is not couples counseling or couples counseling by proxy, but it does serve a critical role in bridging the gap to getting people into services that need them the most. Batterer intervention is not a men's support group. It's a real challenge because sometimes when there's been a lot of shifts in doing Batterer intervention over the years. The oldest Batterer intervention program, Emerge, started in 1977, and Duluth came in 1981. They've got the power and control wheels in 1984. It's not a very old field. However, there have been a lot of shifts in how the work has been done. And over the past 5 years, both Duluth and Emerge have made significant shifts towards making their services focus on how can they motivate abusers to change, how can they focus on how to teach respect. And by doing that, in the past, in the 80s and 90s, there was a focus on we want you to admit. You admit that you're a batterer, you admit that you're abusive, and you need to take responsibility for your offense. Over time, national programs have realized that that's not necessarily effective. Guys will admit to anything, but that doesn't mean they'll change. So again, looking at how it is that you can motivate someone to change and provide opportunities for that is a key point. And when that has started to happen, there's been a perspective that this is a men's support group. It's not a support group, it's an accountability group. So what ends up happening is that respect, that working towards a healthy relationship is where the accountability lies. So working with guys to get them to understand that this is a critical thing for you to shift the way that you behave in your relationship. If you don't, then there will be consequences for that behavior. But it's not a support group. It is supportive of respect, it's supportive of health and relationships, but it's not a support group. It's not individual counseling. I talked about that a little bit already, but in groups, it's a dynamic group. So when talking to one guy, the focus for BIP's facilitators is to get the whole group to respond. Sometimes the best feedback doesn't come from BIP's facilitators, it comes from the other guys. And it's fascinating in a group to see that going on. And of course, BIPS is not anger management. It's not managing anger. It's not spending time really talking about anger so much. It's talking about the underlying beliefs and behavior that cause abuse and control. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the features of anger management in a minute. But before I do that, I'm just going to open the lines and see if anybody has any questions.
The conference has been unmuted.
So thoughts, questions, ideas on what is Batterer intervention and what Batterer intervention is not?
Hey, Chris. Can you talk a little more about how there can be a conflict between Batterer's intervention enrollment and individual counseling that's occurring simultaneously?
Oh, that's actually a really good question. It speaks to one of the critical needs of a community coordinated response, which is that BIPS programs need to work to communicate with those people in the community that are providing services for the men that they serve. So if there's a guy that's getting mental health treatment at the same time that he's in BIPS, it's important to have releases of information signed so that the BIPS program can communicate with that individual counselor and make sure that they're on the same page. It's really confusing and understanding for an abuser if he's getting information in BIPS that conflicts with a counselor who maybe is saying, I can't believe that she's doing this to you, while the BIPS is saying, don't talk about her behavior, focus on what it is that you've chosen to do. So no, I think that when there's definitely a need for some abusers to also be in mental health counseling, but making sure that BIPS are a part of that coordinated community and reaching out to all the providers, having cross-trainings, working together so that it's a shared response as opposed to an individual program response. Does that speak to your question a bit, Carolyn?
Yes. Yes. I have a real live situation like this now, and the counselor, there's been a history there, okay, and her emphasis apparently is going to be on the trauma that this person suffered in childhood.
Oh yes, the childhood piece. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and
I think that on the specifics of that, give me a call later and we could certainly talk about it. I think that the therapists that try to focus on it was really a childhood issue and all of the things you experienced then equal what you're doing now, that has some issues and they can be coordinated between BIPS and mental health providers, although some mental health providers have very strong opinions on family systems and it's challenging to give feedback. But there are ways to have that happen. So certainly, give me a call later and we can talk about that.
Okay.
So any other questions, comments, thoughts on what is batterer intervention and what batterer intervention is not? Okay, well I'm going to move on then, and we're going to talk a little bit
The conference has been muted.
Some of the specific ways that BIPs look at coercive control and patterns of behavior. So those of you that have experience in doing domestic violence intervention as a whole, whether it be with victims and survivors or with perpetrators of domestic violence, you're aware of the power and control wheels. Power and control wheels, as stated, were developed by Duluth in 1984. They developed them after spending a lot of time interviewing victims of domestic violence, and started to coordinate patterns that they saw in those women and what they experienced. Interestingly enough, Emerge was involved in that process. As Duluth was starting to form their program, Emerge consulted with them and was very supportive of Duluth, but ultimately said that while they liked the way that they were developing the power and control wheels, Emerge wanted to take a more individualized approach, which I'll talk about here in a minute. But the power and control wheels are designed from that, interviewing victims of domestic violence, finding patterns, and categorizing them. The only piece on the power and control wheel that's not a part of that, where they were directly hearing information from victims, is the using male privilege wedge, which was developed by pulling out the themes that they were hearing from the women, the themes of experiencing entitlement from abusers based on him being a man and her being a woman. So they pulled that out, but all the others are direct statements and experiences of the women that were in the class. Power and control wheel is, of course, bordered by physical and sexual violence. That's what keeps everything together. So in a BIPS class that uses the Duluth model, they spend time going through all of these wedges, and they watch videos that give examples of this kind of abuse. And then after watching this example, the class spends some time coming up with a control log and mapping out a pattern that they see in this guy in the video. And then they take time to do a control log for themselves on how they themselves use this pattern of behavior in their own relationship. So the Duluth model has evolved, and in the last year they came out with a new curriculum. And what Duluth is focusing on now is a desire to spend 2/3 of their time in class talking about respect and equality instead. Again, that theme of looking at what is the change we want to see in these abusers. So they're spending more time talking about how can you be respectful, how can you be trusting and supportive of your partner, how can you be honest and accountable for your own behavior, how can you be responsible in your own parenting, how can you have shared responsibility, how can you have economic partnership, negotiation of fairness, and non-threatening behavior. How can you be supportive and caring? That's a big focus. And the batterer intervention programs in the state all have access to the power and control wheel, the respect and equality wheel, and many of them use components of the Duluth model as a part of that. So it's really talking about a whole system of coercive control and how it is all those pieces fit together. The Emerge model of looking at hurtful behavior is something that that is in the West Virginia curriculum now. And as I was saying earlier, Emerge decided they wanted to take a more individualized approach. They didn't want to use the power control wheels. They wanted to use the experience of the individual abusers to illustrate hurtful behavior. So what Emerge does is it has each guy in the class talk about their most recent hurtful behavior. So at Emerge, we used to always be very pleased when a guy would identify that, well, the most recent hurtful behavior was this past weekend when we were debating about what movie to see, and finally I just said, well, we're going to go see this movie. That's what we're going to do. So making a decision for her, being kind of alienating in that way, not negotiating or compromising. It may not be violent, it may not be abusive, but it's certainly controlling, and it's hurtful in a relationship. So they'll have guys talk about their most recent abuse, and then they'll have guys talk about their worst abuse. And so often guys will talk about the reason why they're coming into batterer intervention. Sometimes they'll talk about further details of their worst behavior, and they'll use those narratives from the guys to illustrate hurtful behaviors, and along with some educational materials. But Emerge looks at hurtful behavior on this pyramid of the base of all hurtful behavior is alienating, irritating behavior. That everybody, every human being on the planet in a relationship does things that are alienating and irritating. There's no way to get around it. It's that you're two separate people. You have two separate perceptions, two separate ways of living life, that there's automatically going to be times where you intentionally or unintentionally do things that are irritating. And in healthy and respectful relationships, those ebb and flow. And if I'm doing something irritating, I'm going to work to notice it and make sure that I change it in order to, keep impacts from occurring in my relationship with my partner. Abusers maybe will ignore that their partner is irritated and continue doing the action anyway. Controlling behavior is making someone do something or keeping someone from doing something. That when it comes to humanity, all human beings use control to greater or lesser extent. Who doesn't want everything to go their way? I mean, that's part of being human nature. So certainly in relationships, everybody does things where they try to keep their partner from doing something or make their partner do something. And a lot of that, whether that's domestic violence or not, has to do with context. It has to do with the frequency. Is there a balance? Are both partners doing things where they, maybe I try to keep her from doing something one time, she tries to keep me from doing something another time, and it's not a contentious sort of contemptuous choice, but it's something that we ebb and flow about, that we discuss and we maybe influence each other in a certain way. Abusers over time will start to be controlling in a contemptuous way. They won't care. They won't give their partner the benefit of the doubt. They just want what they want when they want it. And so they will work to control their partner, and the context of that control becomes increasingly aggressive over time. The next piece on the pyramid is, of course, abuse, which not everyone does. Abusive behavior is causing pain or fear in another person. And controlling behavior can get to that level that someone could work to keep someone from doing something, and when they keep someone from doing something, they do it in a way that causes that person to be afraid or causes that person to get emotional or physical pain. That's what abuse is. And the difference between abuse and violence is a very thin line. Abuse can be done unintentionally. I could be attempting to control, but I don't intend to cause fear. It happens as a result of me being controlling, but it's not really my intention. Violence is where I intentionally use my tactics of control to make someone afraid or make someone in pain. And violent behavior can include physical assault, it can include threats, it can include intimidation, it can include restraint. And any of those things can, they can all be done in physical ways or non-physical ways. But in Emerge, the discussion is more about the ebb and flow of those behavior over time. And an example that always comes back to me when thinking about this is the case of a guy who he was abusive in his relationship, and he would talk about having arguments with his partner. And one thing to keep in mind is that when guys talk about arguments, it's not necessarily a respectful sort of back and forth, ebb and flow sort of argument. It tends to be an attempt for dominance, an attempt to get something from her or to keep her from doing something. But he was having a lot of arguments with his partner, and what would happen is that he would start to light up a cigarette when he was done talking, and he would just start to ignore her, which would, of course, infuriate her. And so she would continue to talk, continue to argue, and he would just not respond, and he would smoke his cigarette. So he started to do that, and eventually it got to this point where they were arguing, he lit up his cigarette, he started to smoke, she continued to talk, he ended up physically assaulting her. And after he had physically assaulted her, he lit up his cigarettes, and she would stop talking. There was an element of fear that entered into the picture there, just with smoking that cigarette. And he didn't notice that at first. It took him a bit of time, but finally he started to notice that anytime he lit up a cigarette, she would shut up, so he would strategically do it at times where he didn't want to talk to her. And that is where lighting up the cigarette became violent for him. So those patterns of behavior are things that Emerge looks at, is really looking at that bigger picture and how it is that control and abuse intermingle, and how it is that they ebb and flow, and how it is that certain behaviors build up over time, and how it is that you start to reduce those behaviors. So whether using the Emerge model, Duluth model, the West Virginia model has both in there. BIP's programs spend all that time looking at how coercive control plays out in a relationship and what those patterns are. And it's very deep and it's very engaging. So I'm going to open it up for questions for a moment. And
The conference has been unmuted.
Before we move into talking about anger. So any questions, thoughts, comments on the power control wheels or the pyramid of hurtful behavior?
I think that on the power and control wheel, different times when I've had college classes, and we would talk about things, dealing with relationships and stuff, and a lot of people were amazed at so little that as far as that they knew about the power and control wheel, especially when you talk about the way that a person could. As far as how you say, abuse a person without actually touching them. Uh-huh. Because when I was telling them about, I did, and like I say, it opened my eyes too, because of, like I say, when I got to start working with Sandy James and stuff, and we're talking about victims and what all victims go through, and it was just like the thing, even just withholding the person's checkbook. You just didn't think about, okay, you got the checkbook, so what? But you'd be surprised at how, like I say, a lot of your mental abuse played a big part in when you talk about the power and control wheel.
Yeah, definitely.
And like I say, it's an eye-opening thing because, like I say, again, some people from my old neighborhood, we were talking one time and was thinking about the things that we witnessed, and it was almost like clockwork. Every weekend, couples fought. It was almost like, well, Friday night, Saturday night, or, this one they gonna, I guess they gonna get started, and it was just like to us it was like a natural thing. Is this? But when we got older, we realized, hey, that stuff wasn't right back then.
Yeah, no, I think that that it's really an opportunity that gets lost in anger management. Is that anger management doesn't spend time talking about the power control wheels or a range of hurtful behaviors. Batterer intervention does, and it's a really deep way of looking at your entire range of behavior, not just in a relationship, but in life in general, because the power control wheel definitely can apply to interactions with anybody. We're just specifically in batterer intervention looking at relationships.
Right. Yeah. Because, again, you're looking at, like now, the big thing is like elder abuse. Uh-huh. And you look at the things that, the young people are doing to the elders.
Right.
And stuff. So a lot of this, and when you look at, it's batterers are becoming a bigger umbrella than, I guess, than what we ever thought.
Yeah. All right, any other thoughts, questions on the power and control wheels or the hurtful behavior pyramid?
I have a question, Chris.
Sure.
One of our officers had brought up an interesting point about distinguishing between what may seem innocent or right-hearted anger versus battery. Could you touch on how motives play a part in domestic abuse?
Well, I think that motives are really hard to get at in a quick way. I think that that's one of the tasks that courts get charged with that maybe isn't a fair task. Motives for domestic violence typically are about a sense of entitlement on a certain level, that I have the right to get what I want when I want it, and I'm going to make sure it happens, and I'm going to do that in maybe a way that causes fear and pain, and I don't necessarily care about causing that fear and pain, or I'm not aware of it. In anger, like for a road rage situation, there's still an element of entitlement. It still leads to someone thinking, I have the right to cut someone off, I have the right to flip them off, yell, scream, and do all that. But the context of the motive is different. The relationship dynamics are not the same. I mean, a lot of times road rage and barroom brawls and things like that, there is a certain level of dehumanization that's similar in domestic violence. But since there's not that extensive relationship, the amount of it is, the whole pattern of it is different. So does that answer that question?
I think it touches on it. So the context is the biggest issue here, right?
It is, because patterns of relationships being as extensive as they are, the motives tend to be much more involved and harder to sort out. While someone that has a road rage, certainly there's going to be challenges to sorting them out, but it's going to have a lot less impact. Is that someone who has road rage is going to be dangerous to those people that are driving around them, but not to the same person every single time.
Cool.
All right, so I'm going to move us into
The conference has been muted.
A quick activity. So up on your screen now is the how do you define the word anger. Since we're going to be talking about anger management, I think it's important for us to gain a bit of clarity about what even that word is. And the challenge for this activity is how do you define the word anger without using another emotion word and without giving an example. It's a really hard task, and I think one of the challenges within our communities is that we don't, as a society, understand anger. And so how is it that we can even talk about it? So I'll give you a little bit of time. Those of you that have groups, you can come to consensus, or you can just kind of throw up an idea. If you're really not sure, feel free to write in not sure. Just write in your responses, and we'll start talking about them. It's a difficult exercise. Whenever I do this exercise, I always talk about, in the years that I've been doing this, asking this question, I've only had one response that totally got all the components I speak of when I give my definition. And ironically, it was from a 16-year-old girl in a high school group I was teaching healthy relationships to. It's really interesting how difficult it is to think of a definition for a word we use all the time. I think in a sense, there is a certain framework for it. I think that children begin preschool after they have a pretty decent vocabulary. I think an estimate is that they have something like maybe by preschool, 30,000 words, something like that. Maybe it's less than that. But anyway, a lot of those words are emotion words, so that children, when they're first learning to speak, they pick up those emotion words, but they don't have a definition for it. They know the sensation. So when you go to define it, you talk about definitions when you go through school, but you don't talk about those things people already learn. So it's really interesting to think about how our society has even built this up. So I've got a few responses. Keep typing if you haven't come up with something, but I'm going to read some of these off. So anger, an emotional response to a perception of being treated unjustly or that one's rights, relational or other, have been limited, denied, or rejected. Pretty comprehensive. Yeah, definitely. I think that's good. That really is pretty clear. Upsetting stressors, unpleasant emotion, mind-boggling. So I think that's a combination of different ways of describing, but it isn't clear, which is one of the challenges with defining anger. Is that if you're going to be addressing why is there a difference between anger management and BIP, it's an important thing to be able to be as clear as possible. A strong feeling of displeasure. This is one of the challenges. The displeasure is another emotion word, so defining a word by using a similar word is not necessarily giving clarity. An emotion felt when things are not as you feel they should be. That's an interesting one. It's very difficult to do without using another emotion word. Unhealthy reaction to stress or things not going your way. That's an interesting one because the measure of health in anger is interesting to look at, and we'll talk about that in a moment. a reaction to something unfairly done to me, not being in control, and I think that I don't think that one is true, because anger is there are several different flavors for anger. So I think that anger has very little to do with control one way or the other. It's a sensation, which is part of what are fascinating about emotions. It's a negative act that a person may need help to control before it gets out of hand and does damage to someone. We'll talk a little bit more about that one in a moment. An emotion that is displayed in response to a certain stimuli. Anger is a God-given emotion that can be used for the benefit of self and others, or twisted in such a way that it causes harm to self or others. Anger is an emotion. It happens when you don't get your way or you feel you're experiencing injustice, so some themes similar to some other answers. An emotion that causes the person to act in ways that they normally wouldn't. Frustrations, annoyments, etc., that cause the person to sometimes act in a violent manner. Resentment, response to an assumed injury. All right, so those are a lot of different responses that you all have come up with, and I can only imagine that those of you that are in a group setting right now, how challenging it is just to have that discussion amongst yourselves. But I think that when you're looking to create clarity, when you're looking to try and understand how to talk about anger, I think that that we need to be able to remember those guidelines. How can you define emotions? How can you define anger without using another emotion word, without using an example? Because emotions are sensations. They're indicators of certain thoughts or beliefs during a situation. So there's a very big tie to perception in emotions as a whole, and specifically in anger. So I think that a number of you were talking about that point in your answers. Since it's a perception, there's a certain need to look more at those perceptions and less on the sensations. So I think that over time, the best way I've seen to give clarity to what is anger is an emotion. Emotions give you a signal. So anger gives you a signal that something is going on that is not okay for you, and it gives you energy to do something about it. Anger is not negative. It's more positive than negative, in my opinion, because if you didn't have anger, you would never improve things in your life. It's important to know that something's going on that's not okay and be able to respond to it in a way that will deal with that issue. But it also speaks to the reason why domestic violence has nothing to do with anger, because what is happening is that abusers are finding something that's going on that's not okay for them, specifically their partner. They are finding things that their partner is doing that are not okay, and their energy to do something about it is to control and hurt her. So it's less about the sensation, and it's more about their thought process behind that sensation. It's more about how it is that they justify their hurtful behavior. It's more about how it is that they take their partner's behavior and make it a reason to be abusive to her. So it's really important, I think, to understand that when it comes to a relationship, there are a lot of things that you have to get at in order to fully address hurtful behavior and to give someone an opportunity to change. Because when it comes down to it, can emotions, anger included, be managed? You really, I don't think, can directly manage emotions. You might be able to use some pharmacy, some better living through chemistry to shift some emotions. I mean, certainly pharmacological responses to certain mental illnesses is important. But if you're talking about managing emotions, really what you're going to be doing is managing the thoughts to alter the sensation, or you're going to be working to alter the environment. And so anger management uses distractions to shift sensations. So timeouts, relaxation, stress management, it's shifting a sensation instead of looking at the core cause for the sensation itself. Instead of spending time looking at how is it that you can look at your thinking process? How is it that you can look at how it is you feel entitled? How is it that you can look at how your actions are impacting those around you, and instead start to do things that aren't going to be hurtful? Because certainly, there are always going to be things in a relationship that aren't going to be okay for you. That's part of a relationship. Right? Responding violently or abusively is not okay in the context of that. And so in batterer intervention, there's really a focus on that, looking at the core cause of that response, of that sensation, not at the sensation itself. So abusers certainly look angry all the time, and they may feel angry, but it's not about the anger. It's about their beliefs that excuse their domestic violence, that excuse their control, that excuse their abuse. And in domestic violence, teaching distractions delay abuse until abuser is not monitored. So what ends up happening, you teach an abuser stress management techniques, you teach scheduling and time management, and what you end up with is a relaxed, on-time abuser. And what can happen is that abuse will be shifted into another form. So you may have a guy who you teach him count to 10, and so he goes home and his partner is complaining about this and that and all these things that she needs, and he starts counting to 10, ignores her, walks away, does his own thing, and then gets upset in another way and maybe starts to manipulate her so she doesn't bug him. It doesn't stop the abuse, it just shifts it. So doing anger management can actually be very hurtful for domestic violence cases because it doesn't get at the core problem. So really quickly, we're running low on time. I'm going to give you another chance to respond. How is it that intervening in domestic violence, that responding to domestic violence can be coordinated within a community? So we've talked a bit about some of these things already, but just some of your responses. Go ahead and type in and submit, and we'll talk a bit about those. How can you coordinate responses to domestic violence within your community specifically, or on a statewide level? Coordination is a big challenge. Certainly it is something that we do at the Coalition, that we're the umbrella agency for all the domestic violence programs in the state. So we provide training and resources and work to address domestic violence on the statewide level by making sure that we have the most consistent response that we can. We've been working with the batterer intervention community to try and create networking opportunities as well and to create a consistent response. And someone just typed in cooperation. Cooperation is a huge piece. Is that I think that there is a temptation, there's a huge roadblock for people believing that I can handle it all, and not necessarily thinking about the fact that it's important to work with others to achieve a goal. That's why batterer intervention can actually be dangerous if it's done in isolation. If there's no work within a community, if the batterer intervention program doesn't spend time talking to mental health counselors, to court systems, to faith-based communities, to lawyers, to high schools, then they're going to be limited in making any impact, because no matter how long a guy goes to BIPs, he's spending more time in his community than he is within the program. So if you're not addressing community, you're not fully addressing domestic violence. Someone was giving the example of going to schools, community organizations, churches, businesses, doctors' offices. Those are important pieces. Is that sometimes I think it's helpful to think about those groups within your community that never get any attention. I mean, I know there have been efforts throughout the nation to address hairstylists. That hairstylists have a great ability to reach out to victims of domestic violence who come for hair care purposes. And so if they're trained on domestic violence, that can be a great way to do it. Of course, coaches, in schools, that they can be an excellent resource. Defense attorneys, I still think, are an excellent place to gain coordination, because they have a great ability to convince someone of the need to go to batterer intervention in order to improve their relationship, regardless of a court outcome. Sharing information between different levels of the community. Yes, I think that batterer intervention has a core set of skills in how to respond to domestic violence. Substance abuse programs have a core set of skills in how to respond to addiction. And if those two can learn from each other, it's a great setup. And there are some excellent substance abuse counselors that do batterer intervention and vice versa. And I think that the more that we share information, the better. everyone being on the same page. That's an important thing, and authentically being on the same page. STOP programs throughout the state are excellent at being able to work to do that. The challenge is that STOP teams can get into a pitfall of just doing things on a surface level, signing memorandums of understanding, or saying that they're going to do this certain learning, but then when it's not realistic by actually going into the community and doing it or working on an authentic level, it doesn't have the same impact. And that's true with community organizing in general, is making sure that everybody is authentically interacting, not just making it on paper, but making it something that really is realistic and going to have impact. I like this one, is that putting your ego aside and relying on other disciplines. I think that that's an important thing in a relationship, is making sure that your love of your partner is more important than your personal ego. If your personal ego is more important than your partner, then it's going to be really hard to navigate that relationship respectfully. Is that you're going to always be thinking about your own ego and what's important for you, and not about what might be important for your partner. And I think that's true in doing community organizing, is if your ego and your belief that your response is more important than others, you're not going to have a very easy time getting people to work with you. Determining what agency needs better ways to respond and how can you assist with that. Excellent point. Working to have everyone on the same page. Working with STOP teams, working on public campaigns, working with making sure that judicial system, law enforcement, community agencies are all on the same page. Someone mentioned a Cut It Out program for hairstylists. That's a pretty great theme, great title. So yeah, no, those are excellent responses, and I think that we really need to be thinking about that on a greater level, that how it is that we interact within communities. I know that Duluth, that's really their specialty. BIPS is not their specialty. Duluth's specialty is organizing community. And one of the major issues that have come up around the nation is that people have started to use the Duluth response to batterer intervention without a community response. And if you don't have a coordinated community, the BIPS part of Duluth can be really not very effective. That BIPS programs need to make sure that they're doing both, and that the batterer intervention is one small part of working within a greater community. And that's a real challenge, but it also is a critical reason why BIPS is different than anger management. BIPS is designed to work with communities. It's designed to work to coordinate responses to domestic violence that are realistic for a whole group of people, not just individuals. So it's definitely really, really big. And it's important to think about here in West Virginia, where we have such rural communities, it becomes even more difficult to respond. I mean, you have some places in the state that they have to wait 3 hours when they call 911 to get assistance. How do you get resources out to people that are so isolated? When isolation is a key component of abusive behavior, sometimes the rural isolation is a huge part of domestic violence. And how do you address that? How do you provide resources in communities that don't have access to materials? And that's a huge challenge for our entire state. So Duluth kind of has this whole idea of the fact that the desire to make a difference begins with you. How is it that you interact with all of these systems? How do you interact between taking your knowledge and providing the opportunity for others to learn from your knowledge and your experience? And to be able to be open to learning from the experience and knowledge of all these people you're reaching out to. That it shouldn't be a one-way street. That if you're working to interact with a faith-based community, if you go in there with the sense that I know everything about domestic violence and they don't know anything, you might be cutting yourself off from learning how in the faith community dealing with domestic violence is so different. And you may be shut out for that attitude. And so it's just like someone was saying, is that you have to take your ego out of it and be willing to go for the greater sort of response to ending hurtful behaviors in relationships. While Duluth's core strength is the community coordination, Emerge has done some work in community coordination, where batterer intervention is a centerpiece, and how do they reach out to community. And if anybody is interested in getting a more detailed version of either of these charts or anything in the webinar, feel free to give me a call. And I readily admit that I am a BIPs nerd. I could talk about BIPs all day and be perfectly fine. You can email me, you can call me. We have our Facebook page up now, so you can go to the Facebook page, and I recently posted a article on 30 ways to a healthy relationship that could be useful in BIPs programs or in community organizing and going out to communities and talking about these things. But really, when it comes to looking at the difference between anger management and batter intervention, there's no one thing. There are a lot of different things that interact between the two, and definitely a lot of reasons why anger management should not be used for those who have been violent in their relationships. So anyway, this is at the end of the webinar. What's going to happen next is I'm going to close it out. You're going, on your computer, you're going to be redirected to a website to fill out a brief survey on your experience with the webinar. Give me any feedback or thoughts or final questions. And if, like I said, if you have anything moving forward, give me a call. I will be putting this up on our website as a video, and you're welcome to watch the 10 to 12 one and see the differences in some of the discussions we had and some of my responses and how people interacted. So that'll be there as a resource for you as well. You can show it in your communities if you'd like. You can use you'll get, also you'll be getting a copy of the Title 191 Series 3, and you'll be getting a copy of the PowerPoint, so you can use those as well. So anyway, have a nice rest of your day, and we'll see you around on the internet or in person. And take care.
Thank you. Please stand by.